we're about 6 weeks out from Easter. What's your Easter ham going to cost? Probably everyone has Easter ham in the fridge or freezer already, right? But what's Easter ham going to cost this year? Any ideas?
Maybe you had them for 69 cents a pound last week.
16.69. Probably. Does that come with everything else? Well, U.S. government, maybe they're a little bit off. They say it's about $5.50 a pound this year. Who thinks that'll be the most expensive Easter ham we've ever seen? So maybe you've seen kind of the cost of Thanksgiving, right? The cost of Christmas. I'm doing the cost of Easter ham this year. Colin, highest ever?
I think so.
Okay.
Not due to our side of this.
Anyone say it's not the highest ever? Right. So I can say you're both right. Why? Well, what are we doing different these days than we probably have done in the past? We need to differentiate between nominal dollars, which you're paying actual dollars from your wallet, and when we take into consideration inflation, right? So when we look at that Easter ham, the blue line would be nominally, so that's about the highest price we've ever seen for ham, right? But when you look at the red line, you'll see several lines. The big one is October 2014 was the highest real price ham. What was going on during 2014? Al alluded to it, right? So we had PEDD, a very supply impacting disease, right? That was driving it. Inflation wasn't blamed at all during that, right? We can say the same thing as we look at hog prices too, or in this case, hog receipts. So how USDA measures hog receipts is it's the dollars paid for hogs times the quantity, right? And so even though we've seen a bit of contraction in the industry, we're still marketing quite a few hogs, right? And we had the second highest nominal prices ever in 2022. Their forecast for 2023 is a bit of a step back. Now, when you take into consideration the dollar and put it in 2023 values, it's not the highest ever. And why is that important? Well, it's all about the purchasing power of that money, right? So yes, we're seeing higher prices for hogs, but the purchasing power of that dollar is less. Plus, what are we thinking about when it costs of production? It's the highest ever, right? Some of that's inflation driven, but some of that's also just supply and demand driven, right? So when you see pictures or graphs of hog receipts being the highest ever, you take that a bit with a grain of salt, right? And I think all of us in this room understand that, right? When you talk to others and ask about how the swine economy and pork economy is doing, very important to keep that in mind. Dr. Steve Meyer had a great article. I'm jealous. He kind of beat me to the punch here, talking about inflation, right? And the point of inflation is it's all goods have increased. It's not just pork has increased and beef has increased. It's gasoline prices have increased, textiles, clothes have increased, transportation. It's a broad-based increase in all cost of goods bought, and it really looks at that purchasing power of money. So how do we measure inflation? You're probably familiar with the Consumer Price Index, right? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics goes out, they survey about 80,000 different goods and put that data together and say this is the increase in cost of goods for January 2023, which is our most recent data, and they compare it to a year ago. So it'd be January 2022. And so that's where you get the 6.4% inflation. So we've increased 6.4% compared to a year ago. Now, some important things to keep in mind. So this is an index value, right? And we're comparing this index to 82 to 84. So in 82 to 84, it was 100. Today, it's 299.17, right? So that's where, and then we're going to compare to 281, 148, which was last year this time. That's the 6.4%. But think about that measurement. So that green line there is much higher than the green dot is much higher than any other dot we've seen, right? So even if we are flatline, so we don't change the cost of goods, we'll get down to a lower level of inflation, right? Because we're comparing to a year ago. You would need disinflation to get back down to the dotted 2021 line, or more importantly, down to the average we've seen over the last 5 years, the 2016 to 2020. So what does that mean? We're going to improve. We're the best we've seen since October 2021, but that doesn't mean that things are costing less today, right? They're costing more. It's just at a lower rate of inflation going forward. I like to look at it that purple text there. So $1 today, January 2023, is worth 33% of what that same dollar in 82 to 84 was worth. So that gives you kind of a better, I think, metric of looking at inflation. The other part of inflation is this consumer price index is a basket of goods. But we all buy different types of goods, right? And so let's focus in on food for an example here. Food is up 10%. So that's higher than the average, right? So that means some goods have to be up more than the average. Some have to be lower than the average. Well, when we look at meat, which is beef and pork primarily here, that's only up 2.2%. So something else is impacting meat relative to the whole basket of foods. And when we look at kind of protein in general, poultry's up 11.2%, dairy's up 14%. So when we think about, remember, inflation is a general increase in everything. Well, the data is starting to show we're not seeing the general increase in everything necessarily, or at least at the same rate across the board. We'll get into the reasons why that's kind of the case here in a little bit. Another way to look at inflation is just graphing that over time. So this is year over year inflation, and you probably heard it, we're the highest levels in 4 decades. So you have to go back to the early 80s till you've seen these levels of inflation. Now, inflation is not a big deal, or it's not something we talk about because we do have inflation over time. So if you look prior to this recent uptick, our inflation level is 2 to 3%, right? And why is that not a problem? Well, we typically see wages increase at that rate, right? So you're paying more for things, but you have more money in your wallet because wages have generally increased. So that's why it's offsetting that overall increase. Now, it doesn't necessarily all the time keep up with inflation, but sometimes we get higher wages, sometimes lower, and generally it's at about 3%. That's actually what was occurring until we got into the second quarter of 2022. So wages were actually increasing faster or at the same rate as inflation. So the average earner wasn't any worse off. Yes, they were paying more. They had more money in their wallet to offset those higher costs. Now, since that time, we've seen that median wage decline, and we've continued to see inflation. So now the average earner, and I'm emphasizing that average earner, is worse off, right? So some people, even in this economy, may be better off, right? Their wages have increased faster than inflation, right? Because we're talking about median wages, but some are even a lot worse off than what I'm showing here for the median earner. That's across, so I'm talking about consumers, but you could also talk about producers too, right? So higher cost producers are even worse off than some of the estimates that I'll show you for profitability. Some producers may be a little bit better off. I think it's hard to say that they're even higher, better off overall with this inflation, but there's a wide range there, especially when we're talking about how inflation is impacting the economy. I like how Purdue actually measure this, and it pains me a little bit to give another institution credit. But you know, dashboards are the new rage, right? And so Purdue found out a really cool way to look at inflation. So what they do is say, well, let's look at 1 hour of work and how much you could buy with that 1 hour of work. So I show you January 2020 here. 1 hour of work, you could buy 9.1 pounds of ham, right? Or you could buy 8.4 pounds of pork chops, 5.2 pounds of bacon, 7.3 pounds of ground beef. I love ice cream. It's kind of my kryptonite. You could buy 5.9, 1/2 gallons of ice cream, right? Now, wages increased from January 2020 to January 2023, but inflation also increased, right? That's been the big spike. So that same 1 hour work in January 2023, you could buy less of all of those, right? It varies. So you could buy 15% less ham, 5% less pork chops, 5% less beef steaks, 3% less ice cream, right? So that shows you really how that inflation is impacting consumers when we think about, yes, there's wages have increased, but inflation has increased faster. So it's impacted, what that 1 hour work is able to purchase and consume. This is how I like to look at inflation. So, if you were here at my talk last year or the last really prior 9 years of regional conferences, what are the two factors that we talked about? Demand pull and cost push, right? And even really as of late, and I would argue these still factors are a lot at play for the factors impacting the market. So we pumped a lot of money into the economy, right? Post-pandemic, there was less production. We were seeing the pork industry start to contract a bit. You had supply chain challenges a lot downstream, right? So products available were being impacted. So there was a lot of money chasing fewer goods, right? And that helped pull up prices. Equally, you had cost push, right? So everything costs more to produce. And so that helped push up prices. Unfortunately, cost push is bad for producers. Demand pull is good for producers. And then you have inflation that kind of derails everything, right? I put these up here, these two kids playing. This is my 7-year-old daughter on the left. She's very organized, right? She's very built independently. That's my 4-year-old son, right? He comes and is very disruptive, right? And that's the problem with inflation. What's the one bullet we have with inflation to try to control it? Interest rates. And, using interest rates, I've heard it described as it's like a surgeon using a buck knife, right, or a sword, right? It's not precise, right? It's very delicate, our economy. And the fear is what? We put us into a recession. But you need to hit it hard enough, right, that you start to curb inflation and the impacts that I've showed you prior to this. So that's the real challenge here, that our economy in equilibrium is this demand pull and cost push. And hopefully it's the demand pull is offsetting a lot of the cost push, right? But unfortunately, we got this third prong here that's driving. There was a study that the National Pork Board funded that two economists that I've worked with before, Jason Lusk and Glenn Tonser, they asked them to answer the question, we've seen prices from January 2020 to May 2022 increase nominally 27.3%. Why? Right? So we know we have this demand pull going on. We know we have cost push. We know we have inflation. What is driving this market? So they did some really fancy math and found that 50% of that increase, or 13.7 percentage points of the 27.3%, was due to inflation. 20% was demand pull, right? Consumer willingness to pay. But 30% was cost push. So the demand pull that we're having is being offset from a producer standpoint by that cost push, right? And then you have this 50% inflation. Now, this was a period of time, it was 2.5 years, right? And these factors impacting are all changing, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. This is what was looked at for this period of time. Today, we're in a different environment, right? Because we're seeing inflation start to decline a bit. We're going to talk about how some of these demand pull and cost push factors are also changing, because I think those are the factors that are going to be the main drivers going forward as we've started to see inflation ease a little bit, although we're not anywhere in disinflation or anything like that to speak of. I think along with that, as we break down pork a little bit, is another study, same authors, were asked about the price sensitivity. So as we look at, and remember, price does not impact demand, it impacts quantity demanded, but that's still very important in this discussion. So they were asked, well, let's look at consumer price index, inflation over 4%. So we're much more than that, right? We've been double that. But what products are impacted the most when we start to see hikes in those prices? And they're using retail scanner data. So it's like you go to Hy-Vee or Kroger and give them your card, right? So these are actual purchases. These aren't just survey questions. It's actual consumers are purchasing. They found that pork chops or loins here are the most price sensitive. So if you see a 10% increase in loins, consumers going to back away faster than if you see that same 10% increase in, say, bacon, right? So they're more price sensitive at these higher levels of inflation. When they looked at pork altogether, so I think this is a little bit to that question is, yes, that consumers are more price sensitive at these higher inflationary levels. So this is certainly a concern, right? If you didn't see any responsiveness, that would be a much better thing, right? But you're also going to see these across any product. So again, I'm showing you pork. I would suspect you'd see similar in beef and poultry and other types of consumable goods. Another way to look at this, and this is a dashboard out of K-State, and this is where they are surveying consumers. So they're asking them to put or rank the factors that they consider when they go out and buy protein. So this isn't just pork specific, this would be across protein, beef, and pork. This is funded by the Pork Board and Beef Checkoff as well. So Pork Checkoff, Beef Checkoff. There's a laundry list of factors, right? So taste would be in there, price would be in there, food safety would be in there, social considerations would be in there, sustainability, things like that. Again, big laundry list. You can look at the various factors that they use. The take home is in the Q4 of 2021, 46% of respondents had price in the top 4. A year later, so just last quarter, you had 48% had price in the top 4. So we're in general becoming more price conscious or price sensitive as we've seen higher, right? Inflation has come up over this period. Another thing I like to point out is the purple is where we're more price sensitive. So Iowa, we went from 56%, the top 4 to 62%. We're much more frugal in the Midwest, right? They're lighter shades of purple as you get to the coast, right? So other factors are impacting them maybe a little bit more. They're ranking those factors a little bit higher as you kind of move away from here in the West. So that was kind of past looking. I want to look a little bit forward looking, and now what we think are going to be the main drivers. So we look at demand and cost push factors. So we've seen pork here up 9% in 2022. As we begin 2023, we're up 1% overall for pork prices. Now the question is, what are consumers going to start doing because of these higher prices, right? Because that's what's going to impact demand ultimately. So remember, I told you that price is impacting quantity demanded, but how much less they eat, given how much higher that price, that's going to start impacting what we see potentially in demand. So the good news is, and this is that same Meet Demand Monitor survey out of K-State, when they asked consumers, what are you doing because of higher retail meat prices, about a third are changing nothing. So what does that mean? They're paying higher prices and eating the same quantity. So that's actually a positive demand shift, right? And so that's a good sign. It's really been consistent if you look at the beginning of the year versus the end of the year. When you get into these other categories, and this is where things are more difficult to measure, but it is insightful of what consumers are starting to do. So you have one group that are now buying fewer, that's about 30%, but they're still buying the same brand, same cut, they're just buying fewer of that. You have another contingent, about 15%, that are starting to buy different brands. You have another contingent right in that 15, 16%, maybe a little bit higher, they're buying different cuts. So this is where you've heard the trading down, right? So in beef, it's going from steak to ground beef, for example, right? Because you're able to save some money, but still be able to buy beef. The last one there, about 25%, is the smaller packages. So this is kind of happening on purpose or by accident, right? So you maybe heard of shrinkflation, right? The example I like to use, I've been using this whole week, is eggs, right? So when you go to Sam's Club, you used to buy 2 18 packs for what was it, $4 or $5? What have they done? Well, they cut that band, the white band that used to go around those 2 18 packs. They'll give you 1 18 pack for the same $4 or $5. And actually it got up to what, $6, $7, $8 at times, right? So there was, you were paying the same price, but you were getting less quantity, right? And so that's impacting, because of those higher prices. So when we think about what consumers have changed, right, we have some prices changing, we have some quantities changing. And when we look at how that's impacted demand, we don't know why it's necessarily impacted, but we've seen actually demand in 2022 took a slight step back from prior years. So the last couple of years, especially 19 to 20, 20 to 21, we've been eating less pork, but we've been paying higher prices to offset that lower quantity of pork. This last year, we ate a little bit less. We actually paid a little bit more inflation adjusted, but it didn't offset the lower quantity. So demand, I said it was lower, but really it was pretty darn close. It was about similar to a year ago, 0.06% less. How we measure it, again, we ate about 0.5% less. We paid 0.7% more. We would have had to pay a little bit more in inflation adjusted dollars to offset that decline in consumption. So a few other points that I like to highlight here is on the far right is the quarterly demand. So I just gave you 2022 average. You'll see that actually the first 3 quarters were positive year-over-year changes in demand. It wasn't until the 4th quarter that we've seen a large decline in year-over-year demand. So overall, 2022 was pretty positive. We eat a lot of pork in the 4th quarter, so that's why it kind of offset all of those higher year-over-year the first 3 quarters. Then, so this measures, it's another index similar to like the CPI. It measures demand since 1990. Where do you see 2022's vertical bar? How does that rank? It's the second highest ever, right? And so it's pretty much the same as last year, right? A little bit lower than last year. So even though if demand has eased, as we're measuring here, we're still in a pretty good spot historically, right? And so that's really important to keep in mind that as we're going through certainly challenges and seeing prices have eased, right? We're still dealing with very strong demand. So I think that helps kind of give us a good launching point potentially from here. It would be a lot different situation than if we went back to 2008, right? 2007, 2008. Now, the concern is, right, as we've talked about inflation, the way to control inflation is interest rates. And if we do put us into a recession, right? Because what is demand impacted by? Number one is typically incomes, right? Our disposable income, our ability to purchase goods, right? So, and that's why if you look at the last real weak point in demand, when was it? Right, when we seen that last recession back in the late 2000s, right? So that is the concern as it relates, and that's just not pork specific. That's meat specific. It's multiple goods specific of how that would impact demand. The other side of that equation is the cost push, right? And so I pulled several indices here from USDA. I could pull more, but wouldn't fit great on that chart. You couldn't read them, but the story is all the same, right? Comparing 2022 or the end of 2022, November here, to the average of 2021, everything costs a lot more, right? It's not just feed, it's all those non-feed variable costs, right, that go into production of agriculture production in general here. Now, a couple things to take away from this is that if you compare the yellow line to the green line, we've actually improved a little bit since this spring, energy being the big one, right? So fuel prices have eased relative to the highs we were paying this spring. So there is some easing in some of those costs, but in general, they're all high, right? And the challenge is that a lot of these we kind of refer to as inflationary costs. So once those hikes happen, they're here to stay, right? And the easiest one I like to refer to is wages, right? So if you have employees working for you, is it going to be easy to say, are you willing to take a lower wage? As you know, if we start to see inflation ease or even see disinflation, no, right? Those are here to stay. And so a lot of these costs, as we think about, contract or custom services, those things are here to stay, right? And so even though feed, there's a story for much higher feed prices, but there's also a story for much lower feed prices, right? We have a whole growing season in front of us. Those could ease some, right? But those other ones are certainly, in my opinion, here to stay. And so that's going to impact cost of production. Also, those are harder to manage some of the risks, right? So we have ways to manage risk and feed costs, right? There's less opportunity for managing some of those other input cost hikes. So what I'll do is kind of give some price forecasts and then try to fill in here with the second half of my presentation about the general outlook as we look at the pork industry. So what I like to do for forecasts is kind of blame 3 different entities, right? So then you can't blame any one. I'm going to use Livestock Market Information Center. I'm going to use the USDA, and then I'm going to use myself. I am the laziest in any of these. I'm just going to use futures price and adjust for an Iowa, Minnesota basis. If you think of these other forecasts are a little bit more fundamental based, so they're kind of taking in the general picture of the economy as well as taking in different sectors of the industry. Why I do that, jokingly, it is easier, right? But also, if you kind of are along with the efficient market hypothesis that all available information is in the futures price, that's a good forecast. Also, why I like to use futures is you can do something about those forecasts, right? You can use those to hedge, right? And lock in prices that are currently being offered on the board. So when we look at 2022, those were the second highest prices ever nominally to 2014. Actually, there was a time leading up to about August that you could have actually forecasted the record nominal price in 2022, but we did see some easing kind of in the second half of prices last year. And so we kind of settled into that mid to high 90 range for an annual price, right? If we look at over the quarters, we had second and third quarter were stronger prices than that. The forecast for 2023 is on average a composite be about 5% lower. You can see that the future-based prices are a lot more pessimistic or less optimistic, maybe than some of the fundamentals, especially as you look at LMIC, although their forecast is about a month older than mine. So market conditions have obviously changed over that time period. So we get into 2024, at least we got 2 forecasts there to say the first half of the year is going to look a little bit stronger than what we're currently facing right now, is at least what the futures prices are kind of suggesting. Now, from a supply related, or so remember the supply push, we're going to get some of that as we look at the balance sheet here for pork. The general forecast, or the forecast I'm using from LMIC, says we're not going to change production all that much over the next couple of years, right? They have forecasts in 2023, production down, slaughter down 0.6%, production maybe a little bit less, as we might see some higher carcass weights. 2024, maybe we see a little bit of growth from 2023, but that really just puts us at 2022 level. So you can think about it from a supply related is, I think the market is looking for a bit of a direction to go. Once we get to looking at returns, those aren't very optimistic. So it's really kind of seeing a bit of a holding pattern as it's related to production. Now, those forecasts a bit contradict what we've seen in the latest Hog and Pigs report. And, the latest Hog and Pigs report, the surveys would have went out, mid-December. We're reporting December 1 inventory. So obviously we've seen things change in the last 2 months, right? And how that's possibly impacting production. This last report, when you looked at the breeding herd, was actually up 0.5%. So that was the first time we've seen an increase in the breeding herd in 2.5 years, right? So a sign of maybe a little bit of optimism, right? That we're seeing some possible growth. That did pair with the farrowing intentions that were expected up both in December, February. So what we're just closing here from this last quarter, and then the intentions were up 0.5% for next quarter. We'll talk a little bit about those. I also want you to remember here, look at these market hog inventory forecasts or projections, right? So it looks like for the next 6 months, slaughter would be down roughly 2%, right? So that's what the latest hog and pigs report said. So if we believe those farrowed intentions for March and May, that would be the smallest number of sows farrowed since 2016. That I think is maybe a little pessimistic given where the breeding herd is currently at. So that would be this green line here, and that green dot would be the farrowing rate or the breeding herd utilization. If I look at farrowing intentions divided by the breeding herd, right? So that would say that farrowing rate is maybe a little bit higher the last couple of years, but generally lower than what we've seen, maybe pre-disruptionary period. So what does that tell me? Well, in the next report, I would either expect producers to maybe come in a little bit more optimistic on the December, February, what they actually farrowed. So a little bit higher than what this last report showed here for December, February, or that USDA will revise down the breeding herd. So USDA would probably make a revision to the December number, which would be somewhat reflected in a lower number for March 1. Now, in reality, maybe a combination of both of those, right? But I think that'll be something to watch as far as how those adjustments are made relative to production. The one thing that I think could be making these counts maybe a little bit difficult or harder, both from a USDA standpoint as well as from a producer response to survey standpoint, is we've seen cull sow values just see some wide swings, right? As some of the really high prices for cull sows, and I benchmarked that kind of against replacement prices here, right? Where you've seen replacement prices rather muted. I'm just kind of using negotiated barrel and gilt and put the genetic premium on those. So maybe the turnover in the herd, which could be a little bit higher, I think that could maybe explain some of the reduced pigs saved per litter productivity numbers. Maybe that's making these counts just a little bit difficult from when those gilts are entering the breeding herd, when we're counting them as sows and such. But that's more or less just kind of a hypothesis on my part. Now, remember I told you we expect slaughter to be down 2% since December 1. Well, we've actually seen slaughter down or up 0.4%, right? And we've actually even seen it stronger since the beginning of the year. Since January 1, we're up 2.2%. Now, if you would have asked me the reasons maybe a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, I'd say, well, we had some big winter storms, right? That maybe delayed some slaughter. We had holidays were on Sundays, so that obviously kind of I think impacted some slaughter schedules, and maybe we'll catch up to it, right? But now that we're almost 8 weeks here into 2023, it looks like one, there may be more hogs than we counted, right? That we're seeing larger slaughter levels. Or what's the other factor that could be going on? Why we see larger slaughter numbers?
We spit up marketing.
Yeah, so we're pulling hogs ahead, right? Now, the way I can look at that, or the easiest way for me to look at that, is hog weights, right? And I like to look at the livestock mandatory reporting data. So this is the most comprehensive of the data that we have. It's the 201 report you may be familiar with. And I like to break it up by producer owned and packer owned, right? So packer owns roughly 40% of the marketings, the producer owns the rest of these. These would be all types of hogs. So sell and negotiate all the way up to other purchase arrangement. The purple line is where we're currently at. So 213 pounds here, the last weekly data. You'll see that that's relatively low, right? Especially compared to the last several years. It's right at the 5-year average of 2015 to 2019. On your right, there's producer-owned hogs, right? And those hogs, I keep the axis the same. So you can see those hog weights are always heavier, right? And so that spread is usually about 9 pounds or so. But you'll see in comparison that those weights haven't fallen as fast, right? Yes, they are below last year and the year before that, but they are well above 2020. And I'll remind you, pre-disruption 2020, right? That didn't occur really until into April. So what I think is explaining that is if you look where packer margins are currently at. So this is my attempt to calculate a packer margin. The gross margin would just be the pork cutout plus some byproduct minus the hog price. And I'm going to use the total weighted average of that hog price. The net margin would say, well, we need to account for other variable and fixed costs. Some literature I've read said it's about maybe $30. Naively, I'm just going to split that between fixed and variable. Why that's important, I'm taking capacity utilization here into consideration. So that's why we need to break those up a little bit. And then I say, well, it costs more today than it has, right? So let's add some costs on top of that. We could maybe even add a little bit higher, but I'm saying $6 per head. So when you look at those net margins, a packer, if they're buying hogs on the open market, right, any which way, negotiate all the way to the formula, they're losing roughly $15 to $20 per head. They're killing their own hogs, they're losing roughly $60, $50 to $60 per head. Well, why is that the case? Well, it costs a lot more to produce a hog today than it does to buy one, right? As we look at producer margins, right, those margins are in the red, right? So this incentivize a packer to pull on the cheapest hogs. Well, where are the cheapest hogs? They're on producer-owned hogs right now. So I think that's why we're seeing those hog weights really come down, and we are pulling some hogs ahead. Now, do I think it's all of that in the increased slaughter? Likely not. I think there is probably a few more hogs than we anticipated in that hog and pigs report. But I think a big part is this. And that will mean that, you can only slaughter these hogs once, right? So we will see some slighter runs. And what's weighed on the market as of late, I think will start to, support the market as we see some tighter slaughter levels. My estimates of production costs are quickly. Yep.
Do you still see packers buying large Saudi operations now? Because we're still seeing that in our area. JBS buying out.
Yep.
But if they're losing more money, that would mean they shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, well, but look at the long run averages too, right? So yes, that's where we're currently at. But I'll go back to even 2021, where are those integrated margins, right? Those are some of the highest, right? So you very much need to look at long run averages. I think certainly on big business decisions like that. Why I also like to show packer margins is, these spike and divot big time at times, but long run, they're pretty close to break even, right? And I think that's important to keep in mind that, we do see a lot of gyrations, but we do come back to equilibrium. So to your point there, will those integrated margins last like that forever? No, what's going to switch? Seasonal pricing, right? So as we get into summer, I think we're going to see possibly some very strong hog prices, stronger than we're anticipating now. And that's when we're going to see them pull on their own hogs, right? If we certainly see those prices spike. Now, as we look at production costs, these would be my estimates. I like to refer to these as very naive estimates. I'm just buying inputs as I need them, right? So there's no risk management that it goes along with estimating these production costs. The big takeaway is, regardless of where I started at in 2020, we're about 50% higher, right? Than we were that time period. The biggest hike is likely behind us, right? That occurred 20 to 21, 21 to 22. This year, possibly that's more of the inflationary increase, I would say, is that 3% increase in those production costs. So knocking on the door of $100 per hundredweight, which blows by any record we've seen, right? As you go back to 2013, that was the last high. Remember, that was the last coming off the drought year, right? 2011 and 2012, we had drought, nationally in 2012. That drove what we were dealing with then. We're at a new level for production costs. Then, a new normal really is here for the foreseeable future as we look at those production costs. So remember, I told you that we're going to see probably the third highest hog prices ever in 2023, but the highest production costs ever too. So when you equate those, 2023 is going to stick out, right? That is some of the lowest margins we've seen in pork production in a long time. right? And also, I want you to look at the variability there. So I gave you the average, it's about $20 per head loss. But that's down to $45, $46 per head, with the high in the summer only being about $7 per head. This is, again, think about this as very naive. I'm just taking the weighted average of those prices, assuming no risk management, right? So this is gonna kind of just give you that barometer of profitability. Now, what I've done in the last roughly year to 18 years or so is remove out the manure credit. So this is something that I added to the returns when I kind of took them over for John Lawrence. And this has been the best and worst thing I ever did, right? The best thing, because I think it is important to tell that story, right? That the manure value that we get from pork production and the sustainability aspect, right? We can put that back on our acres. It certainly cuts commercial fertilizer production or use, but also when we add this to the pork returns, it kind of masks the true story, right? So think about adding $10 to $12 to last year's and this year's, right? It tells a much different story in pork production. And this is, think about as kind of a book calculation, right? So what I'm using is the nutrients we get from manure, some book values of what we get from a representative farrow to finish operation. And then I'm using Iowa's cost of production USDA survey for the commercial fertilizer prices to back into a manure value, right? And you can think about this manure value as something, if I could sell manure, so that does happen on a small, case by case basis. But also it's the offsetting my commercial fertilizer bill too, right? But that's predicated on what? Those acres being pretty darn close to my hog barn, right? And that I could fully utilize this manure. So there's a lot of assumptions that go along with this. But the take home story is that these have increased tremendously from $2 to $4 to $10 to $12.
So when you figure that manure credit, have you taken off the cost of whole?
I have, but it assumes those acres again are right next to my hog barn, right? So that's the challenge on some of those assumptions, right? Now I can haul that manure a lot farther today than I have in the past, right? Because of even with higher diesel prices, with the value of that manure. So I think again, look at the general trend as opposed to the exact value, but the story is very much that this has helped offset, what we're not seeing is very favorable pork margin out.
Do you know what percentage of the pigs that are contract finished where the owner of the pig doesn't get any value out of it? Is it half?
That's a good question. I don't know if others know that. I remember reading there's a Successful Farming magazine that labor was one and manure was two, like on kind of how important that was, who got that. But it's a case by case basis, but I don't know if it's 50-50 or
Somewhere.
yeah. So and that's a good point. So the value of that manure depends on who gets it, right? And those are contract terms. And so, sometimes those contract terms, you may get a lower rate per pig space, but you get the manure. That's obviously more important today than it has been in the past, right? So, another thing to keep in mind when I showed you those returns, remember it was the weighted average of all those hog prices. Well, no one sells the weighted average, right? When you sell hogs, you sell it negotiated, very few. Or via a formula, right? And USDA puts it into 1 to 4 buckets when they report those hog prices. And so we built a dashboard here, and I have to give my graduate student Ezra Butcher, great name, right? If you're working in meat, he's a big Missourian, so he's a great guy. I hope to get him out more often. And Ezra is really fast to do things. I think we were talking about this, and I said, hey, this would be great if we could have a dashboard. Because USDA has a report, it's the LMHG 215 report that shows hog price distribution, but they report it as a basis and it's a PDF. It's kind of hard to use. So I said, hey, can we put that into a dashboard? And so we could kind of look at like a drought monitor, you can compare different time periods, and like 2 days later he came and he had it done. So apparently I'm not giving him enough work or he's just that fast. But so what Ezra did here was he pulls in the data for that report, And what I did was show you the last 3 years of hog prices for this time of year, right? So I think it's last Thursday would be on the far right, 2022 and 2021. And it shows that distribution. So we have a much wider distribution today, from about $60 per hundredweight to 110. The weighted average is 80 or so. Last year it was about $70 to 110, but a little bit higher weighted average, right? And then the different color bars show you the different ways that those hogs are purchased by packers, right? As you would expect, the other purchase arrangement, which includes cost of production, contracts, as well as all specialty hogs are in that category. So higher cost of production, you'd expect those prices on the right side of the distribution. The value I think in this tool also is it allows you to benchmark, right? So how you are selling your hogs, what category you're likely put in, you can compare that to where that distribution is, right? So when it comes time to renegotiate that formula, it gives you kind of a good idea of how you've been ranking over time with those prices. Where do I think prices are going? So I pulled up the lean hog contract here. This was as of last Friday. And we've been in a sell signal since really the beginning of January. So that's when the 9 and 18 day season daily average, the average across the 40-day average. And prices have kind of been really holding in that 102 range or so for recently here. What I like to look at, what I've been using recently is options prices and these volatility levels that the CME reports in a nice, again, dashboard. That's kind of where we're going and showing data. I wrote a Wallace's Farmer article about this, and I give you also the link to where you can get these volatility measures from. And you can go on the CME website and pull these up. And I've done that here for the June contract. And so what's important to measure here is this orange line, which is the June contract a month ago. The blue line, which is the June contract today, or close to today. And these are called volatility smirks. And the higher that smirk relative to the other line tells you the higher probability. So if we compare to a month ago, prices, there's a lower probability that prices will go lower. There's a lower probability that prices will go higher. That's another way of saying the market says prices are going to likely stay kind of where they're at for the foreseeable future. So maybe a market kind of looking to react one way or another. And so why I say that is I think, if we do see some big movements, not necessarily daily movements, but some kind of trends to this, that may be an indication of where we think that price may be going. Another market that I like to look at is the cash market for SEW pigs and feeder pigs, right? So this kind of gives a little bit of the general sentiment of producers out there that are buying these pigs. It's a relatively small part of the market, right? It's kind of, we sometimes refer to it as the residual market, but you'll see the market really reacts at times, right? To conditions when we need pigs and when we really don't need pigs. Well, look at what happened to prices last spring, about this time. There were some rather optimistic buyers out there, right? Because we've seen very strong summer prices. And I think anticipation, we could see prices even stronger. And you've seen really producers bid up the prices. Well, if you compare that to today, those prices are much lower, much closer to maybe what we've seen in 2021. So again, a lot less optimism today than maybe what we've seen this time last year, which is certainly reflective of those future prices. I'll also lay this with that, I've heard anecdotally that there is capacity available too. So it's not necessarily a lack of demand from a space standpoint. We're not necessarily full, I think. So, I think this is very much driven by those economic conditions we've discussed so far. So where do I think we could see, support in the market? I'm going to end with demand pull, right? Because that's really what we care about. That's what is going to help producers, right? The cost push is what's weighing them down. The demand pull is how high prices could go or how much they could be triggered from here. The pork cutout is well below the levels this time last year, right? Comparing the dotted blue line to the solid blue line. and it's broad based, right? So when I break that cut out by the various primals, all primals except for slightly the picnic are much lower than year ago levels, especially the belly, right? Seen the belly really take a step back from what we've seen at this time last year, but also a large decline in the loin as well, which contributes the highest percentage to that cutout. Now, that's kind of, as we look at the domestic picture, the export picture, we're seeing some easing there as well. So I'm kind of throw up all the countries here for background. The blue is the highlight here if we think about USDA's forecast. So in 2022, exports from a volume standpoint were down roughly 10% compared to 2021. Forecast for 2023 is about flatline, right? Now, it's a couple of things to keep in mind when we think about exports. This is volume, right? It's not value. And that's the other part of the equation when we think about export demand. Just like here in the United States, it's per capita consumption, and it's the price we're paying. Exports, it's the volume we're sending and the price they're paying, right? And so value hasn't necessarily declined as much because they're paying much higher prices too. Now, China, as we look at them, they're actually up, maybe a little bit surprisingly, as we look at accumulated exports and the total commitments so far. There's been reports out of China that the situation with COVID, or at least their recovery, is maybe a little bit better than anticipated. And so when we look at, jump ahead one, USDA has revised imports of meat from China here in their latest forecast. If you compare 2020 October to January of this year, this is very much related to their economy responding a little bit better, maybe than what we thought back in October. Part of that value, when we think about the money we're receiving or the prices being paid for our exports, is very much related to exchange rates, right? And we think about the fear of a global economic recession. Where does money flow? To the safest economies out there. Well, who do people believe is the safest economy? Even though we're us, right? And what does that impact? Exchange rates, right? And so that makes us less competitive with our competitors, right? Because now it takes more of our foreign currency to pay us, right? If you're competing with us, so it takes less of that competitor. And similar to our customers, again, now their purchasing power is already declined because of inflation, but it's also declined because of the exchange rate impact. And so I'd say the biggest impact we've seen is South Korea and Japan in 2022 compared to 2021. We've actually seen Mexico strengthen some. They got their devaluation considerably there in 2020, but they've improved really since then, which has helped in exports. They were a strong market for us last year. That's all I got formally, but any questions, comments, rebuttals?
With the higher price of beef, do you see people going to pork proportionally, or where do you see that trend?
Yep. So, when you think about demand, prices of substitutes and complements matter. Complements really don't matter when you look at it in reality. And so, that is something to monitor, that wedge between beef and pork. It hasn't actually changed all that much because beef, we've actually mitigated that short term because you'll have to put a lot more cows and heifers on the market, right? But it's going to start to widen, even if pork stays where it's at as far as production. Beef is declining, right? And that's going to push up prices. Now, the one thing that's good and bad, depending on how you think about it, is consumers have become less price sensitive than they have in the past. Two changes in those substitute goods, right? So if you're pork, that's good. If your prices increase and you have less people going to poultry and maybe back to beef, but it also means as beef prices spike relative to pork may not gain that many more pounds than they had maybe historically because you become less price sensitive. So, I would say that's good. That's going to be an impact, but it probably isn't going to be. It won't be as high of an impact as we've seen historically in that case.
Yeah, Lee, tell me about your thoughts on the negotiated sales and pricing mechanism. You know, it's a very small percentage of the market that we're basing prices on.
Yep.
And then we keep getting this huge swing between winter prices and summer prices. And is that part of the reason we swing so much? Is because it's based on such a small percentage of the pigs sold?
Yep, well, so, yeah, so when we think about the negotiated market, it's roughly 1 to 3% on any given week or month, how we look at it. So, you know, that 1 or 3%, is, you know, what some would argue is true price discovery, right? Because it's actually, you know, negotiation between a producer and packer. The challenge with that is we're using that negotiated percent as a base price in a lot of the formulas that we're using. So you may be using, you know, it might be a Western Corn Belt +1, right? Or Western Corn Belt +50 cents, or Iowa, Minnesota plus whatever. That's deriving that price, or helping derive the biggest part of that price, the base price. And then you may have some premiums and discounts on top of that. So I think certainly as you see, you know, if you believe, and I'm in the camp that that's a residual market, right? It's going to be bid up when supplies are tight and you know, demand is strong. It's going to be bid down when we don't need hogs, right? That's going to impact those formulas. And we've seen that. Now, those formulas also there are other ways. So some of it's the pork cutout, right? It might be 89% of the pork cutout. You know, my understanding more and more there may be hybrids. So 50% is going to be the Western Corn Belt, then you're gonna have a pork cutout. And so, you know, there you may see that balance out, but we've seen the cutout also, you know, if you're looking at cutout now, you know, that you could argue maybe suppressing price a little bit relative to where it was last year, right? The biggest challenge I see with that is when you think about, so those hogs are in the swine and pork market formula. Well, and so some are a swine formula, some are a pork formula, and some are a hybrid, right? Well, the challenge there is the CME settles on that, right? What's the CME? The lean hog contract, right? So you have the lean hog contract settling on hogs that are priced off of the pork cutout, right? So that causes some challenges there. Now we also have a pork cutout contract, right? That settles off the cutout. But we've not had much interest in there. So actually I had a conversation with USDA last week because they were kind of giving me their annual call of, you know, these are some changes we've made in reporting. You know, what are some things that you'd like to see? My number one is get back the weighted average for Iowa, Minnesota, the head count, because they don't have that anymore. The other one was you guys got to break that up somehow, I think, because I think it's hurting price discovery because you have, you know, these formulas that are both a lean hog as well as a pork cutout. It's not easy though, right? Because you have these hybrid ones. So which bucket would you put it in? But I think it would give the market a lot more transparency. And to Al's point, you're going to see less volatility, or you'll know where that volatility is coming from, right? You'll know if it's coming from the lean hog versus the pork cutout. So I think that would be helpful. But they don't listen to me, they listen to producers. So, you know, you guys got to beat that drum whenever, you know, you're in those conversations with people. Yep.
Kind of a bigger term issue that I see, I got a little bit different perspective maybe on the market, or the industry in general, but, and this goes to Al's comment he made over there earlier in regard to integrators growing. And one of the biggest concerns I have, and you know, we work with a lot of integrators, is that they're continued is to me, independent producers, you take the top 30% of producers, independent integrators can't. They can't. I see benchmark data all the time. But the point that I think is very concerning for the independent producer is market access. And those integrated systems are continuing to grow and limit market access, especially when you get into more peripheral regions of the Corn Belt. And so I see that as a bigger kind of a policy issue for, I think, more like NPPC to address, or even, you know, even our congressional people from the whole livestock competitiveness. We've seen this in other industries. I mean, it's happened in the poultry industry. And my biggest fear for the swine industry is, you know, I think we compete from a cost of production and productivity standpoint, but, you know, Al, you know good and well today, you don't give anybody a loan if they don't have shackle space reserve. And those integrators are growing to limit shackle space. I'm telling you, that's what's going on. You know, now their goal is to get to where they can buy that product cheaper than we can raise it. But in the interim, they're trying to limit shackle space, market access. And that's my concern for our industry, big time. And I'm not sure that we're fully addressing that as an organization or policy standpoint. And it'll be a slow come. It's not going to happen overnight, but just look at that, what's going on in the industry, you can kind of see it coming. And I know that I've heard those discussions before.
Yeah. Well, and the challenge with processing capacity is it's, you know, those investments, well, they're long-term investments, right? And they come online, you know, in rather chunks, right? So you think about the last expansion in pork processing, you know, it was maybe 5 years ago, right? And that was pent up demand from really, we hadn't changed since the early 2000s, right? And then finally, you know, we got that investment. Beef's going through it right now, right? Like, so, you know, that's kind of the challenge, I think, when you think of growing that capacity organically, is it's not, you know, it doesn't come online until you really, really need it, right? You kind of go through some fourth quarters of the hog industry challenges there. You know, the administration has targeted, and most of this has been at beef, right? Competition and market access and increasing small and medium-sized packs. Now, you know, I have gone on many of my talks that I didn't include it here is, you know, we think about resiliency, that's much different than what is being talked about as adding packing capacity now, right? So when you think about the challenges we had in processing, small and medium-sized packers aren't able to do anything when it comes to the major disruptions we've seen, right? Just because it's about throughput. So we could argue, you know, economies of size all day, but it's about throughput, right? So when you limit one plant that does 20,000 head a day, you need a lot of small 200 head plants to ever do that, right? Or you need 100 days. You don't have 100 days in pork production. So I think, you know, that's the challenge when it comes to policy is when you're thinking about the ownership of these, that's the model that allows us to be very efficient, but also very effective. So, I agree. It's a, you know, policy issue that there's not an easy answer.
The other thing goes along with that is it's never been so expensive to enter this business as it is now.
Yeah.
This is the most expensive pig we've ever raised, most expensive buildings we've ever had to build, or we've ever had to buy. So it's going to be very hard for anyone to start in this business.
What's the payback now? 15 years? Probably on
Insurance.
yeah,
You see,
20, right?
I didn't see the compare data that they did put out here a couple weeks ago on the cost of the 24 day in the last 5 years. It was like 5 years ago, like $206 a pig space, it's like $450 with interest cost and everything on there.
We're not saying even 15 now, it just don't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was up in Luana, and we were talking to a power wash guy, that he actually an old student that owned a power wash company and a banker. And I said, you know, have you been hearing any interest in hog finishers and, you know, adding some? They said those were the conversations we used to have a couple of weeks. We've heard nothing in, you know, last year plus, right? So I think, you know, it very much points to those costs being that much higher, right? Is a big prohibitor.